Hey folks, I want to give a big shout out to everybody who is supporting the Patreon, because what they're really doing is they're supporting accessibility when it comes to this podcast. The money that comes from that is used in part to provide transcriptions for every episode so that anybody who would rather read the interviews for whatever reasons is able to do so, and it allows these great conversations to reach a wider audience and those who otherwise might be unable to get the benefits of that material. So a big thank you. And of course, there's also a bonus in it for them, which is they get access to all sorts of great private material that only shows up in that space, including, related to this episode, our feminist playlist of music that has inspired the Stacking Skulls and Brianna Saucy over the years. So all of that can be found over at patreon.com/thehermitslamp, or follow the links in the show notes. As they say, every dollar helps, and it all goes towards something that I feel is deep and important. Welcome to the Hermit's Lamp podcast. I'm here today with Jesse Hathaway, who I have a hard time describing exactly who Jesse is. Jesse does all sorts of traditional magical traditions in the ATR, as well as being an author and creator of magical products and a participator in a whole bunch of other traditions as well. So I'm just going to hand it over to Jesse and say, hey, how would you introduce yourself here?
Hi. Wow. I think. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of magical CVs as it is, but I summary-wise, I guess, I'm an Olocha. I'm made to Obatalá in the Cuban Lukumí Santería tradition. I am Tata Quimbanda, which is I'm a practitioner of Brazilian. It's an Afro-Brazilian sorcerers tradition that is sometimes paired with Umbanda or Candomblé. Sometimes people let it stand on its own. It's a Congolese-derived practice. And traditional witchcraft has always been there for, as long as I can consciously remember, into early teens and things like that. But I study whatever interests me. Doesn't mean I'm initiated in all those things. Doesn't mean I'm practicing all those things. But I have a passion for magical traditions, folk magic, folklore. I have a huge love of Mexican curanderismo, which is a familial background. And although I did not go into that as a practitioner, I think also just I'm a babbler is probably important for my CV as well. Some of these things like curanderismo, culturally, you never called yourself that thing. That was something the community called you. So I guess in some ways, whatever people call me is whatever they call me, and they can come to me for what they come to me. And the main thing is that I'm just trying to do as much training with elders and keep things going as I can. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point, and maybe we can start with that. We were talking before we got on the line, right? And we were talking about these sort of questions of authority and who gets to call oneself authority, who's an expert in these traditions, or an elder, or, or even just, an acknowledged practitioner, and I think that this question of where does authority come from and how does that happen sort of inside and outside of traditional practices is a really interesting point, right?
Yeah.
For example, you're talking about being a curandismo, like that's not a thing that you call yourself. That's what other people would call you if they're going to call you that, right?
Yes.
I think that that's really fascinating, and I think that we see a lot of change around that, where traditionally everybody lived in the same place, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody generally didn't move around that much, and people probably saw a person in that practice grow up, experience their training. They saw that they got the nod from other people who were acknowledged as that, and at some point they started taking on their own, practice, right? Mm-hmm. But in the internet age, right? That looks more like a good Instagram account, maybe. Maybe a nice website. You know what? Like,
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think about those evolutions and those changes that are going on around that.
Yeah, I mean, the apprenticeship model, which it's not a certificate model, right? It's something different where you are under an apprenticeship, you are with the elder, and their clients see you training with their elder. You know, the visibility is a very different thing. It's not just classes. It's not just, herb walks occasionally. You are the right hand of that elder for a very long time, and they see you go from incompetence to competence to fluency, and that kind of replacement for that elder, if and when they pass, is there, and it's a very different model than what is done now. But even within, I think, the kind of internet age of teachers have dozens and dozens and dozens of students. Look at the Brazilian model of a terreiro, where there is going to be one buyer, Mai de Santo, who is the head doing everything. They're doing all the initiating, thousands of people, but each person has a Iakakere, Babakekere that's taking care of their needs, that is more individualized in that way. But still, you lose your individuality when you train. And that sacrifice is very difficult, I think, for a lot of our very Western internet friendly minds about promoting individuality, how different you are, how a certain, I'm studying this tradition, and the tradition studying you is part of the thing that we forget too.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's part of the good training, is learning how to get out of the way and do the work, right?
Yeah.
Like I think about the elder Olochas that I trained with and spent time with or am at ceremonies with, right? Mm-hmm. And certainly if there's a junior person there to open in the coconuts or whatever, they're going to do that. They're going to be like, hey, go do that. Go mop the floor, go whatever.
Yeah.
But also, if there's not, they're just going to grab the hammer and go, right? And, there are these funny things that come from that training and that experience. And opening coconuts is one of them. I watched the people who are new, in my house come and open coconuts. And, I'm like, I always look over, I'm like, oh, they're taking forever, not in a mean way, but just in a and then that feeling of like, I can open a coconut in no time because I've done hundreds and hundreds of them now.
Yep.
And those subtle things that you would see being in the space with somebody else.
Yes.
Make that big difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Even the way that we mop, the way that we call it watering your elders. Just the you have to go in a good way. Not I don't mean that in a but the idea of culturally, like those of us that are more on the introverted side, it's a lot to just go and say hello to everyone. It's a lot to enter a room and to each person say hello. It can be exhausting before the ritual even starts. Mm-hmm. So, you learn shorthands, or you find ways to be able to enter into the social language that is needed to be able to access things. But going around and asking everyone who's older than you, do you want something to drink? Can I get you coffee? Can I get you water? Can I get you something? Even if they say no, it's a lot. For whatever reason, that service-oriented side of things leaves, it works both ways, in the sense that it allows people to introduce themselves to each other in a way that's not just small talk, but also people see that you are trying to take care of people in the room and make sure that everyone's comfortable. And it's an interesting side of things that, it's not a critique. It is a critique, but of the internet culture basis, or the book learned culture of not realizing that the book is still your teacher, and it's a one-sided conversation that you don't get to necessarily appeal to the author and ask for clarification. But you didn't teach yourself. You learned from a book. You didn't teach yourself because there's a language that you are relying on that is built on cliches and allegories and metaphors and things like that. So there's this idea of picking yourself up by your bootstraps into a magical tradition is not quite necessarily the case, even when you're doing it by yourself. And if we believe that spirit is intervening, then spirit is also teaching us as well, and how well we can refine that, our own inner ear to listen to that, is also something there. In a community, a community setting, people often ask in ATRs, like, what books can I read? Read the room first. Like, take the temperature of the room and listen, because the best conversations happen at 2 a.m. after all the things are done for the day, and the cook finally gets to sit down because the kitchen is shut.
Sure.
People are,
or they're in there and you're talking to them instead of rushing around.
Yeah.
And then they go, hey, come and look at this thing that I'm going to do here, right?
Exactly.
And even in the simplest of things, like cooking the inyales, right? Like just cooking the parts of the animals that go to the Orishas. There's all sorts of stuff to learn about, just even a simple thing like that, and if you're engaged with the people and talking to them and have a relationship with them, then they're going to invite you in and be like, hey, if you're looking for this, do this way, or here's a good way to do it,
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise you're just, you can do it and it will serve the job, but you're missing big swaths of the teaching, right? And it's always the thing that I'm really aware of in my position as somebody in Toronto, far away from regular practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
My knowledge is good, there's always things to work on, but my fluency in some of those little details, I'm well aware that it's not as strong as it would be if I was living somewhere where I got to just work more often, because you can never learn those things from a book. Nobody ever thinks to talk about that, right? Unless you're in the room with the person and then you're watching them, be like, hey, what was that? Why'd you put that in there? Yeah. I didn't see anybody do this before. You
can read a book about running a marathon, but it's a very different thing to do it.
Right.
And we talk about that all the time, of watching, if someone doesn't know how to mop and they say they're an active santero, you're like, maybe not. But there's the side of it of, there's different types of knowledge, and the modern age promotes one type of knowledge, which is the facts, the history, that type of thing that can be transmitted via literature in that way, in the written word. And it's an interesting side of things, but it's very different when the body knows it, when the ways of learning in the body are different from the head. And even so, it's an interesting side of, really making sure if someone doesn't know how to do certain things, you train them. And even, for example, my early years as an Olocha, I come from a house of a lot of old elders. Like, physically, they are more aged. And so even though I could be doing other things, they needed someone to lift the big water buckets and up and down the stairs and do the heavy lifting and open the coconuts. So even though there were other tasks that I could be doing, I was doing the manual labor because I was younger and able to do certain things that my amazing elder ladies could not. And that's an interesting side of things too, because then they sent me out and go to this house and start studying with them a little bit here, and then come back and branch out so that I could get different experiences. And I think one of the things that's very interesting with in the history of Santeria is just because the houses started working with each other, things got very homogenized very quickly through public opinion, both in a good and a bad way. There are variances to the way things are done, but the variances between the houses are actually pretty small. There's kind of a liturgized, homogenized way to do things that is acceptable. And when you vary too much from that, both out of tradition or vary too much from that out of lack of tradition or lack of knowledge, you kind of get pulled back into what is the acceptable practice. And that's an interesting side of it. So it's actually preserved a lot through public opinion, through the fact that there's 7 different lineages represented in a room, because you invite those people to work. Because in the early days, you didn't get a choice on who was coming to work because you needed people. So you got any santero that was in New York City, come work this thing. And so new traditions kind of, or at least parallel traditions, start aligning. They start coming into a common practice, and adaptations have to happen for the modern age. You can't do certain things the way that was done in Cuba or in Nigeria. So it's those modifications happen, and elders make those decisions. When one person makes those decisions, it can get a little crazy. But when a community comes together and says, how do we resolve this problem? How do we take care of this? Then there's more options, I think.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Well, and I think that it goes back to kind of a couple questions around that. One is, for me, I think that where there are differences in lineage, it's important to know what they are, even if they're small. It's interesting where there are lineage differences that I think it's really important to become aware of those and know what they are, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we are initiated into a lineage, and therefore if our lineage does it a certain way, we should do it that way. And, in these different times where you might go to different houses and do things in different ways, I think that it's important to respect, the way other people do it, and also know that when you're in your home, you do it a different way, right? Or when it's your event. But I think it also creates a lot of unnecessary dialogue and drama. And I think that we see this in all the magical communities, right? At least everyone that I've ever been in, which is more than a few. It's this thing of, well, we don't do it this way, therefore it must be wrong, right?
Yes.
This is not, I've never seen this, therefore it must be wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that, it's such a sticky topic, right? How do we understand what is tradition? What is traditional variance? How do we understand what comes from experience, and what might be other groups' experience that we could integrate? Mm-hmm. And how do we judge what is just, manufactured garbage, right? To make a few bucks.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly. So, I don't know. What do you think? Give us a guide here. Give us some solid rules we can live by.
Because I'm I'll talk.
I'm giving you all the authority right here. Community of one gives it to you, Jesse.
Yeah. No, I think obviously, reliable or people that you can confide in and ask opinions on, that the chain of eldership is really important. And it's not just for this, I don't support the complete submission to elder guru style where it allows for physical abuse or emotional abuse in that way. And that is a model that does exist and has existed. But there is a possibility of an elder and mentor, elder and minor model that allows for accessing opinions that can contextualize things based in the knowledge that they have that is more than your own. Mm-hmm. How do you modify? I think there's the side of it too that's always interesting, of when you don't recognize something. If you're secure in what you have, you don't attack the thing you don't know. You just look at it and that's interesting. Let me see where this goes. And you have to gauge the point of when it seems off and what is your agenda in making sure that it's correct or incorrect. Mm-hmm. And that personal side of it, this idea that there's an objective one tradition that was passed down from Adam and Eve, it doesn't serve us. And I certainly within the ATRs, I mean, the differences between traditions, houses, the differences between Santeria and Candomblé and different Orisha practices are huge. And at the same time, the Orisha are very flexible in what they say and do, and they're not going to sit there and nitpick. But there are ways specifically that the tradition has evolved to make sure that Orisha comes, that Orisha is there, that is unique to each lineage, unique to each house, and has similarities and commonalities and landmarks, that are recognizable. But at the same time, I don't see elders get as upset about something that's off, just minorly off. We're like, oh, we don't do that, and don't worry about it, because we do it this way. Yeah. I see a lot of people who are younger get really pissed off about keeping tradition intact.
Mm-hmm. And I've talked to elders who talk about that's how they felt when they were younger, right? Yeah, I'm like, oh, when I was like 18, I was so mad about all these things. But now I'm like, well, I can see both sides,
Yeah. And it's the question of like, do you spend all the time stamping the thing out that you don't like, or do you spend time investing into the model that you feel is more correct and more profitable for people to follow? Mm-hmm. And, fighting for what you want to see as opposed to what you don't want to see. And there's merits on both sides. I think personally, When is it that we try not to innovate a lot of times in ATRs, right? Of like, you innovate through necessity only, and a temporary thing that you're still asking clarification on from elders or spirits or things like this. But you try to innovate as little, because otherwise it's not necessarily what you're practicing anymore. It's not recognizable. And that's its own thing. Certainly, opinions change as you get older too, and you more experience. It's not just older. What is the Chinua Achebe quote of old age is respected and wisdom is revered? The same thing is similar in our models here of like, someone who has worked the room for 5 years consistently at the foot of an elder is going to know more than someone who's 20 years old and has never worked the room as much, work it once a year. Someone who births a lot of Orisha constantly or is taking a lot of clients is going to have a different opinion of how things function, because they realize, I don't do it this way because it gets in the way of blah, 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 blah. Versus if it's your first time giving, it's like a first time child. You're going to make a bunch of mistakes. You're going to realize you might put a lot of effort into things that you won't necessarily do on the fourth child down because it's important. And that practical experience, sometimes we just have to suffer through our own inexperience and be humble and keep going to elders and asking opinions and keeping our eyes open as to what is being done. And if we're in a solitary tradition where it's less likely that we're going to have an elder who's going to speak to our direct needs, then learn from other things around you that you admire and can pull in. It's really hard to reinvent the wheel constantly.
Well, I think it's really interesting, because when the first store that I read out of had a predominantly Afro-Caribbean clientele. And, so I was, although I was getting involved in the Orisha traditions and stuff at that point, I didn't have a ton of experience at all. And I wasn't initiated as a priest. So it was just mostly my own development that I was focused on. But I've done a ton of ceremonial work and, initiations along all those lines. And one of the things that was really interesting was I would end up having these conversations with, spiritual Baptist priests and, other people. And they're like, you really understand, whatever it was that they were doing, right? They would always say, you really understand our tradition. You really understand this. You really understand the African mindset or whatever. And I understand that they felt that was true. But I think that in what I knew was, what I actually really understand is magic. And I understand that there are generally fundamental things that are kind of true across the board if you're really engaged at a deep level, and not sort of in there's only one faith or there's only one source or any of that kind of like, Victorian colonial nonsense, right? Yeah. But in the sense that when you understand that spirits are real, and you have the capacity to genuinely speak with spirits, and you're going to work with materials, nature, candles, whatever, offerings, then though the surface of those things or the tradition and lineage piece changes those, there is a fundamental mindset that's there kind of around the world, around those kinds of things. And once you get that, then you can relate at that place, right? Which is completely different than sort of going in and sort of saying, as I've certainly seen other people do, well, yeah, exactly. I know this tradition and the spirits gave it to me and therefore I'm able to do this and that and whatever. It's like, no. I know how to talk to spirits. And in fact, often even spirits of other people's traditions might lean in a bit through a reading and nudge me in a given direction. That's not the same as understanding their traditions or whatever, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we're talking about fluency and magic or fluency, we're talking about a practicality as far as how to utilize those things in everyday life. And that is something that is, I think, palpable when someone knows and can give practical advice, practical actions to achieve certain things, no matter the tradition. And certainly when it's still theory in someone's head and less pragmatic, you can tell that too. There can be a struggle to articulate something. What are the next steps? And where do you go from here? And we can talk about cosmology and philosophy, which differ from person to person, let alone town to town or tradition to tradition.
Yeah.
And those finer points, but the practicality of it, that is that's something different. You have to be somewhat fluent in order to give good practical advice on how to move forward. And parroting something is, you first learn by saying what you know and going off of what you've seen. But the more you can expose yourself to, the more people's styles, you'll start to learn different ways of approaching things. And certainly, I'm being reminded of computer search parameter recently that was the issue with diagnostic tools from computers that are trying to diagnose illness and things like this, is that they're not programmed to look for something that isn't there. And this is something that humans can still do very well, in that not just looking for the problem out of the commons of the sets of things that are there, but to have a revelation of what could still be needed by the person. Not necessarily, when someone comes for a reading, it's not just their conscious problems we're talking about. We're trying to look and bring those things that are unconscious to the surface too, to see what is actually the root of something that needs to be addressed. And those things come from having a good foundation in the basics in order to, you have to do primary colors before you start doing secondary colors, and understanding what those things are. You can't mix secondary colors trying to get primary colors. You still have to know what that order is. And I think it's very similar in Magick. There's basic advice on things, and some people will give out the basic, like, here's an uncrossing, here's a love drawing, here's a bend over type of working. And those are set vocabularies, and other people might tell you to go light a candle at the base of this tree and the spirit is going to take care of it. Mm-hmm. And that's the model that they're using. And both are pragmatic in this sense, but I wonder how much materialism it still enters in the kind of scientific revolution, atheist materialism that sneaks in, because that is the paradigm as Westerners that we are raised in. There's some variance in that based on familial upbringing and religious upbringing, but the idea that spirit is not necessarily tangible in the same way, and it is actually affecting the materia to do the thing, is a less popular model. And it's interesting now, like once you get introduced to the concept of a charged statue or something like that, people want to put loads in everything, and they don't necessarily know what goes in it. They want to know why do I put these things in, or I'm putting this in there to symbolize this. Whereas in spirit-based traditions, the spirit might possess someone and it could put anything it wants in that statue and breathe on it or splash it with whatever, and now it's charged. It doesn't necessarily have a logic that we can understand as to why it picked that item to represent that thing, because it's not representation. It's passing something, and that is a battery of power that is being used. Not did you have all 732 exact ingredients
exactly
to put in. That spirit could go for a walk and pull a clump of herbs and give you one of the most powerful baths you've ever had. Whereas if you try and duplicate it with those same herbs, it's not going to be the same, because you're not that.
I was talking with somebody in the store recently about they were asking me where I get the crystals that I buy from and about the mining practices, and I think that those are really important questions, and the short answer is about half of what I sell, I know pretty clearly where it comes from. And short of, hopping on a plane and going to the mine, I feel like the people I'm buying from, who are buying directly from the miners, I believe them, it's the best we can do in this day and age, a bunch of the other stuff, I'm far less clear about where that comes from. And I would like to reduce that amount, to be more clear that there's no, human rights violations and horrible environmental destruction and so on. But it's complicated and it's difficult, and, in this industry for sure, and in tons of industries. Mm-hmm. They were asking me about, the magical influence of where something comes from and how it's handled along the way and all of these kinds of things, mm-hmm. right? Is the stone that where and how it was mined different than the stone where you don't? And when I was talking to them about it, I mean, certainly I have my own political and social view on that stuff, which is, I think that the stuff that is harvested with respect is always better whenever we can manage it. Whenever I harvest things, I always harvest them with a lot of respect. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a great thing. But I think that there's kind of also another question mixed in that, which is, where does the actual magic of what you're doing reside, right? Mm-hmm. And in the context of a stone, right, is it concretely in the minerals and the energy of that? And I think that's part of it. You know, there's some really interesting crystal books that talk about how the crystals form and how that magic, how the energy of that relates to their sort of fundamental crystalline structure that varies from different stones. And, you've got color and you've got different participations and all that kind of stuff. And, what other things activate this, right? Mm-hmm. And, there's the power of the thing in and of itself, but kind of as you're saying, there's also what the spirit might want, right? Yes. Like, if I'm working with, one of my guides and my guide says, grab me a piece of iron pyrite and let's do this with it. Mm-hmm. Certainly the element is important, but the activation of that particular spirit through that element is way more important in that equation, probably. The actual force through which the spirit makes the change or consecrates that thing, and consecrating a statue is a good example of that, right? Mm-hmm. That is the force of the spirit making something and putting it together and anchoring it. And then we get into, and then sort of the third thing that I see, which is related but not exactly the same, which is, especially with things like plants and stuff like that, right? There is also the living entity, which is that plant in and of itself, right? Mm-hmm. And not necessarily just the specific one that you're working with, but the sort of deeper energy of a given plant in the world, like ayahuasca or other things. People, often talk about that as an entity that wants to return to the world. But I think that that's actually fundamentally true of the bow trees in the front of my shop and, my crown of thorns plant and all of those things. Mm-hmm. And in those, I'm definitely, in the way that I'm working with them in the space, connecting with the collective entity of that plant, Mm-hmm. And so I think that this idea of how are we working and what are we doing is so interesting. And I think it's something that people don't really see those distinctions. I don't hear them talked about, Mm-hmm. So I'm curious what you think about them.
Something that comes to mind, I have, as long as I've been crowned, actually, so 12 years, been working with an experimental theater company here in New York City called Jesse, and it's using theater as a tool to investigate something else. What that something else is unique to each person, but we're talking about investigating the sacred through the tool of theater, through the means of theater. And this question of intentionality is quite interesting to explore. And a question that gets posed a lot by the director, and then as we start something, is when does the ritual begin? And is it when you have the audience fully there and in a theater context and the play starts? Well, no, it started long before that with the rehearsal process. And then again, when did it start before that? And the question is when you bring it, for me, the answer, and it seems to be a common thought on this is when you bring awareness to it. And so if I know that I'm doing an important ritual next week, and every day I'm waking up going, I'm doing this next week, what can I do today to manifest that more smoothly and making sure all your bills are paid and, the bag lunches are done for the day and everything, that becomes part of the ritual. Mm-hmm. And there's this interesting question of intentionality when you know that something is ethically harvested and you're going to the store, but you're in a tizzy and distracted going to the store, and you're not present when you're picking up the crystal and you're putting it on the thing and, talking on the cell phone and looking at things. What are you doing to destroy the intentionality of that good harvest act? I mean, there's that side of it too that's always interesting to me of, you can have good ingredients prepared by bad chefs, and you can have shitty ingredients prepared by expert chefs that still taste better. You can have ingredients. You can have a horrible, angry chef prepare something masterfully because they know how to treat the food, and maybe they're compartmentalizing their emotion. Maybe they're not. They're that missing ingredient of grandmother love that goes into the cookies. Does it make it taste better? Does it not? It is. I think for all of us, the question of intentionality is an interesting side of it, of what are we bringing to it and how are we contributing to these seeds. I think I like to look at things as seeds of potential, and certain things allow them to mature and grow. The side of it of looking at what is it that makes something work? What is it that allows something to happen? I think anybody that can say definitively is selling something.
And they probably have a great brand name trademark.
Yeah, absolutely.
Attached to it, right?
Yeah. I think the exploration of that and the curiosity of that is what, for me at least, drives me to constantly keep practicing. That that you can, like you were saying earlier, that sometimes, if there's someone there that can mop the floor or open the coconut, there's a way to enter into that where sometimes the task just has to get done and that person is learning it and they're going to make their mistakes. There's other times, I remember recently we were short-staffed at an Olocha ritual, and I was the one on my hands and knees mopping, because normally it would be someone else, and that's fine because I'm usually assisting someone. But I had such pure joy in mopping the floor, of just like, it was such an interesting thing of caretaking and kind of going into the trance of mopping, which was an interesting thing too, of still remaining present enough to know what else was going on in the room so that I'm not mopping something carelessly, but also this balance of, I guess it is a little bit of Zen in the art of peeling potatoes. But also for those of us that get lost in our heads, to be present enough and aware enough of what else is going on, so that if, something escapes, whether it's a child, a chicken, or a potato rolling down the hallway, that you're able to notice it and catch it. Not the child is rolling down the hallway, but hopefully that metaphor still makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things too. For me, I think one of the big differences between before making Ocha and after making Ocha, or maybe before receiving Orishas and after receiving Orishas, is when I work the tradition, whatever that is, I can feel the joy of the Orishas themselves. Like when I tell, like, well, I'm going to feed him something, and that might be a sacrifice, but it might just be like, I'm just going to, hey, I'm going to cook you this. I'm going to toast up all this corn for you, and whatever. Can feel that energy, right? Yeah. And I feel like that energy extends to mopping the floor, to like all of these kinds of things, right? To even some of the less pleasant things, like plucking the chickens after, or wrestling with a ram that got out in the rain, or whatever, right? It's just like it doesn't really matter from my experience, and maybe this is just me, but I think that it's part of this thing, because that service to the spirits and their pleasure in it, lifts up everything else, right?
Well, I think it's an interesting parallel too it would seem to me, at least the way that I understood Greek myths and Norse myths presented to me as a child, even reading like Edith Hamilton, they were very anthropomorphized, the gods. So anthropomorphized that it was hard to imagine that they were appearing in nature. They just owned nature. And it seems that, as my understanding of these things matures, that perhaps that is a kind of modern revamping of a lot of pagan ideology and pagan theology. But I'm in one of Matori's books, I believe, he's interviewing a priestess of Yemaya in Nigeria, and talks to her, and she talks about other people worship their deities. We do our deities. And that when she interacts with water in any conscious level, she is participating in Yemaya. That Yemaya is an act of mopping or washing a body or washing the self or cooking, and that water itself has a respect and a consciousness, and that consciousness for her was named Yemaya. So it was this concept, and we talk about this in the Spanish verb hacer does this very well. To hacer santo, you're doing santo, you're making santo. That when we participate in these activities, we're actually participating in Orisha. Orisha is not a human. Orisha have incarnated as humans, but Orisha is as much the sound that the drum makes and gives us pleasure. Orisha is the flash of insight of a new idea. Orisha is the feeling that we should go left and not right at this intersection. You know, there's things that are in the body that is not just in the head. The head leads it, of course, but it is broader and more experiential. And then the body becomes an extension of the head, and the head grows because it is experiencing the world. And I think there's something different. You know, mopping, you are participating in an Orisha act that is, yes, you're finding the joy, but there's also that the deities of water that are there, that bathing can become a sacred act again. Like, when does the ritual begin? When you bring attention to it. And you could make everything about the spirits that you're serving, or you could make very little and only be like a Sunday religionist, as, you know, we talk about of, you know, it's a controversial thing to talk about the lack of ability to have separation of church and state, but religion is there to justify politic. It always has been the concept of religion. Karen McCarthy goes into that, and I promote her all the time just because I find her such a fascinating. She's an ex-nun that writes on religion, and her book Fields of Blood looks at religion and violence. And she talks about that individual religion and spirituality is a very different thing than organized religion that is sitting there trying to justify the actions of people in power. Whereas the concept of religiosity or spirituality and those things, what we do in our day-to-day is each of us. But it's not just about going to church on Sunday, promoting the separation of that, thinking that going to church on Sunday makes you a good person because you went. It's part of it. But how do you treat your family? How do you treat your coworkers? How do you treat the people around you? You know, how do you treat the land you're on? And this is it's not for everyone, because it's very difficult to constantly be on in that mode. It takes practice. It's a muscle that you have to build and stretch. And I do think that mopping and carrying buckets of groceries up and down stairs is a way of stretching that muscle, or at least it can be when you present it in that way. If you're just bossing someone around and say, go do this, go do this, go do this, they may not see that they're stretching a muscle. Yeah. And that's the thing too, is responsible training. You have to say, why are you doing this? Because if we all stop to take out the trash, we can't prepare for the ritual that has to happen. But if you, who cannot be on that side of the curtain or be in that room at that time, can take out the trash, then you've helped us do that ritual. It is part of it. It's that way of, what was the thing where president was going to look at the space program and ask the janitor who he was and what he did. And he said, this is my name and I'm helping send men into space. You know, that it was the responsibility or the contextualized importance of every single task in a temple. It's a very real thing. That if that person doesn't do it, someone else is going to have to do it. And hopefully take away from that person balancing the books that day. But it's an interesting thing. You see it in different religious communities, and friends with some nuns in Connecticut at the Benedictine Abbey there. And it's so interesting to see, because they follow the liturgy of the hours, their work spurts are 2 hours. They work really, really hard for 2 hours, and they stop, change, and sing for a half hour to an hour, depending on what the liturgy is that day, and then go back to work again. So there's no warm up to working. They know they only have 2 hours, but they also don't rush. It's just like, you're going to do it. You're going to get to work. And that's
I think that also that dedication, right? Like they're going to stop and sing, you know? It's like, before I got married, my spirits, you know, my ancestors in a mass, a misa, were basically like, we want you to go to church before you get married. We know you're not getting into church. That's fine. But we want you to go to a mass. And we were like, all right. And so I went, and it was me and my partner and one other person in this massive like Anglican church at 5 p.m. on a Friday night. And I remember being there, and it was very obvious that all the people in the congregation actually had no idea what to do, because the priest was like, is anybody actually going to come up and take communion, or should we just carry on? Right? We're like, oh, I didn't know this was the point, right? Yeah. Which is amusing. But it was also very obvious to me that if nobody had been there, he would have just done the mass. Yeah. You know, and that sort of devotion of, we're going to stop and sing, we're going to do this, we're going to do this thing. I think that kind of devotion is just astounding. You know, it's so wonderful.
You're speaking very, very true to Jesse. We do a piece every year around this time. We just had our first performances of it, but called Fool's Mass, which is based on the kind of Feast of Fools idea from the early modern and medieval period. But it's a bunch of fools who are have to do the Christmas Mass even though the priest just died. And it's the exploration. It's a buffoonery piece, and there are extreme elements of humor and tragedy and but the idea that this choir comes together to sing, and normally, we play characters of different ability and function and responsibility. And some of us are troublemakers, and other people are rule followers, and what that chaos ensues. But we know that there's songs that we sing and come together, and there's something that's profound there in the silence and listening to each other as well. And the chaos breaks out again. And how do you do this? How do you continue in what you know, even if there's no leader? I always find that interesting, like the dynamic of a classroom when the teacher has to leave to go to the bathroom or something like that. And like, does it function as the same? Like, depends on how the teacher has run the classroom a lot of times. But it's an interesting side of things, of doing what you know when you know to do it. Is still lots of times we're like, oh, the authority figure's not here, I don't have to do it this way, I can do it this other way.
Exactly right.
and you go, okay, what did I just lose, and what did I gain from that? What was the actual benefit from not doing it the exact way I know how? And so many times I think that it can come up in our systems of divination, right? That you have the tools, you know exactly what the problem is, and you're not using them.
Yeah.
There's nothing new here. There's no new problems. Every problem that comes up, exactly why it's there, and you have the tools to fix it, but you're not doing it. So what are you looking for here? That's an interesting thing too.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question. Again, as somebody who's sort of far away from regular practice, not having an extended community here, I definitely run into this sort of angsty emotional piece, and where I'm like, I got nothing to do. I don't know what to work on. I got nothing to practice or whatever. And this desire to learn more, right? And what I noticed at one point was, I was like, well, that's cool if there's more to learn, and there's always more to learn. But also, how solid is your singing of Osign, right? How solid is this piece? How about you, make sure that you can say the prayer for each of the Orishas, the Oriki, or learn a song for each. There's often so much sort of in our immediate vicinity that we can tend to. And if we take that agency back to ourselves, right? Yeah. In that way of well, what do we do when there is nobody else watching, right? I think that's where the real work is, right? I mean, the rest of it is a bunch of work too. And not to dismiss it, but at least for me, that real work is, I'm here, I'm doing this thing, whether it's, Orisha stuff or other stuff, or with my guides, or, working on the cards or other projects. It's always that question of okay, what do I need to do? How do I make myself do it? How do I do the stuff that doesn't seem glamorous, but moves it all forward? And how do you find the joy with that, so you can sort of continue with devotion around it, or faith, or those kind of old fashioned words, right? Yeah.
And also the benefit of when you approach things in that way, it only informs the other things you're doing. So meaning, you're going back to basics and finding new interesting things in them, then it means that the possibility of you finding new ways and new depths to everything you're doing, because again, it's that muscle that you're stretching that is developing a way of looking at the world and aligning your feet to a new path. Perhaps it's the same path and you're learning it better. It's nice to return to the things we know sometimes and realize that, oh gosh, there's a lot more here to examine. That side of it, I know that's wonderful. To be able to really examine what it is that we know and develop the questions of ourselves of like, okay, you think you know this for sure, and that's great, but what happens when you do it again? Do it one more time. Mm-hmm. I guess for me, my background's undergrad is in theater, and doing things again is not a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Doing things over and over and over. There is something of benefit when you have something so memorized. It allows for a new freedom in finding things out. And it's not the same as reading the prayer. You know, there's a difference there. And what is it to do this, and how you say it, and what it opens your mind up to. It's like Catholic parallel of the rosary, that saying the prayers is just the bare minimum. Yeah. Saying the prayers of the rosary is the minimum. The visualization that is supposed to happen, because the prayers are by rote and coming out of your mouth, and your hand knows to feel for what beads it's saying, that you're actually envisioning mysteries as you're going through the rosary. That's level 2 and above. But, you know, if all you know is the prayers, then that's what you do.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, watching elders conduct ceremony, right? They're mm-hmm. singing a song, they're doing a thing, they see somebody doing something they shouldn't be, and they don't even lose a beat, and they're like, put the bucket of water down, blah, 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 and they go right back to it, you know? Yeah. And sometimes they even just sing it in the tune of what's going on, right? Which is always amusing. Yeah. And
it is.
And that kind of fluency is just, you know, it's so profound, and it comes from that showing up and being present and having walked it so many times and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's such a fascinating thing to see and practice, and it comes out of so much experience with it, right?
Yeah,
like being on theater, you know, on stage, when the person you're across from like says the wrong line, what do, right?
Hey, you don't just repeat the right line. You've got to work with it. And and successful theater, something that is a wonderful exploration, is making each other look good. Mm-hmm. You know, in ritual, there's so much correction in the way that things can happen. But how can you correct the person so that they are empowered to embrace this correction you're giving them? Because you get flustered, and everybody's going to respond to that differently. But, you know, how can you make the person look good still, and explain to them, hey, there's this better way, try it like this. Yeah. And really, because then they're open to the critique, they're open to the correction, and they don't feel ashamed. But there's also, we have to get over our shame too, especially in these oral traditions, because you're going to be corrected in front of other people. You're going to make a mistake. And, you know, I remember thinking about the profundity of, you know, we talk about our attitudes when we're younger and things. And I remember serving egum before a ritual once, and everybody's talking, and really only the people up at the front, right at the shrine, are actually paying attention to what's going on. And it was frustrating, and I can't believe people aren't paying attention, and realizing like I am so not present because I'm so concerned with everybody not paying attention that I'm not paying attention either. And it was just oh my God, it all works if one person is focused up front. The whole thing, the whole ceremony is approved if one person, one conscious act makes it happen. And then it's great if the whole room is aligned. It's great if everybody will be quiet and focus. It's great if what that is, but it also is humbling to realize how much profound change or acceptance or of a new trajectory can happen with just one person focusing.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
And being on point and on task. And that's really beautiful.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to leave it. Go out there, folks. Be present, listen, learn, and be kind to yourself and others, you know, so we can all grow and expand and get wherever it is we're going to go with all of our magical practices.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for hanging out with me today, Jesse, and being on here. I deeply appreciate it.
My pleasure.
You got all sorts of great stuff going on online. People want to check it out. Where should they come and find you?
The store I run is Wolf and Goat. So wolf-and-goat.com. You can type it without the dashes as well. We're on Facebook as well. I do a podcast with Dr. Al Cummins called Radio Free Golgotha intermittently. We're on Facebook as well, but radiofreegolgotha.com. If you're interested in paratheater and want to do some strange explorations of self and the world around you through theater, jetchitheater.org, DZIECI theater with an RE.org.
Spelled just like it sounds.
Yeah. And it means children in Polish. And I'm sure there's many other things I'm forgetting, but generally I'm around a lot online and even more so in the back alleys of New York, I suppose. So it's It's a pleasure, and thanks for having me on, Andrew.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, as always, for listening, folks. We've got some great interviews coming up to round out the rest of the year. And as always, every share and every support of the Patreon is deeply appreciated. It helps keep this project running, and it helps spread the word and make it accessible to everybody. And we'll see you in 2 weeks with another episode.